A ring, a phrase spoken without thinking, and a decades-long silence that collapsed on a random night. She did not know that, by opening her mouth, she would also open the only wound her mother never had the courage to show. The Orchid Terrace in Ikoyi was the kind of restaurant where silence was expensive. Crystal chandeliers poured golden light over tables covered in white linen, wineglasses aligned with precision, forks positioned with a ruler, the scent of the room mixing gourmet butter with old money, and every detail of that place screaming without having to raise its voice that not everyone belonged there. Tiwa Bello knew this better than anyone. She belonged there as an employee, not as a guest, and she had learned in the months since she started working at the terrace that this difference had to be respected with every movement of her body. Snite, spine, namen teps, namen just in the right measure, neither too shy nor too familiar, invisible when necessary, present when called, the kind of presence that serves without existing. That night, Table 12 was occupied by 4 men in suits, a business meeting disguised as dinner. Tiwa recognized the pattern. Conversations too quiet for the room, phones turned face down on the tablecloth, and the discreet tension of those who smile out of obligation while calculating inwardly. The man at the head of the table was different from the other 3, not by his clothes, which were as sober as the others, nor by his posture, which was also straight and controlled. It was something in his eyes. While the others gestured, negotiated, and tried to persuade, he only listened, with that heavy attention of someone who does not need to speak to be the most important person at the table. Tiwa calculated that he must be of a considerable age, with completely white hair, large and weathered hands, the kind of hands that have carried real weight before learning to carry a pen. She approached to clear the empty glasses. It was then that she saw the ring. It was on his right hand, on the ring finger, an unusual piece. It was not the kind of jewelry bought in a display window. It was dark, with a stone of deep amber, crossed by a very fine golden vein, set in a silver band, worked with small carvings on the sides. The kind of ring that has no copy. The kind of ring someone has made once, for a single person, for a single reason. Tiwa stopped. Not really stopped. Her feet kept moving, her hands kept clearing the glasses, but something inside her stopped completely, as if her heart had recognized something her head was still processing. She knew that ring. She had grown up looking at it on her mother's hand on a random afternoon, holding a cup of Lipton tea in their small kitchen, the stone catching the light from the window. This ring never leaves my finger, Tiwa. Never. This one has a story that I will tell you one day. A day that never came. Can I bring you more water, sir? Tiwa's voice came out in the exact tone her training demanded. Calm, professional, nothing that betrayed what was happening underneath. The white-haired man looked up. He had a gaze that carried weight, not of arrogance, but of accumulation, of someone who had seen too much to be easily impressed. Yes, please, thank you. Tiwa filled the glass. She was about to step back when the words came out. They were not planned. They did not pass through any filter. They came from her deepest place, that place where we keep what we cannot explain. Excuse me, sir, I know this is an inappropriate question. She was surprised by the sound of her own voice. The other 3 men at the table turned their faces toward her at the same time. The white-haired man raised his eyebrows slightly. But that ring, my mother has one exactly like it. The silence that fell over table 12 was different from the silence that reigned in the rest of the restaurant. The silence of the Orchid Terrace was the silence of money, comfortable, controlled, designed. The silence that took over that table was of another kind. It was the silence of something hanging in the air before it falls. The white-haired man did not answer immediately. He looked at his own ring, then at Tiwa, then at the ring again. And in that short trajectory ring, waitress, ring, something happened to his face that she could not name at the time. It was not surprise. It was older than that. It was the face of someone who had just heard a knock on the door they swore would never sound again. What is your mother's name? He asked. His voice came out differently, quieter, more careful, like someone holding a very thin glass with both hands, for fear of breaking it. Bisi, Tiwa replied. Bisi Bello. The man remained motionless, not for a second, but for several. The kind of immobility that is not hesitation, but an internal collapse disguised as composure. His hands resting on the table stopped all movement. His breathing changed. Tiwa noticed the vein in his neck pulsing faster than before. One of the other men at the table, younger and impatient, gave a slight cough. The kind of cough that meant, let us return to what matters. But the white-haired man did not move. Jide, said the man in the gray suit beside him, in a voice that tried to be discreet, but was not. We need to define the terms before we… Excuse me, Jide said. without taking his eyes off Tiwa. "Give me a minute." The tone was not rude, not aggressive, but it had a firmness that left no room for negotiation. The other three exchanged glances, that silent communication of those who do not understand what is happening, but understand that it is not the moment to insist. Babajide Alao leaned slightly forward. "Where does your mother live?" Tiwa felt her heart race. There was something in that question that was not simple curiosity. It was a contained urgency. It was the urgency of someone who had gone a long time without asking a question and now could no longer delay it. "Here in the city." "Why this ring?" He turned his hand slowly, as if seeing his own finger for the first time. "It was made by an artisan in the town of Bida decades ago. An old man who worked with stones and metals. He had no shop, no display window. He only worked by commission, and only for people he knew personally." Tiwa said nothing, but inside, the truth was sinking in, slowly, heavily, loudly. "He made two," Jide continued. "Only two. In the whole world, there are only two such rings." The silence returned, but now it was different. Now it had weight and form. It had edges. "And you have one of them?" Tiwa said, her voice coming out smaller than she intended. "And your mother has the other?" He completed. It was not a question. Tiwa finished her shift that night like someone wading through deep water, each step heavier than the last, the words of the conversation looping back as she folded napkins, washed her hands, and changed out of her uniform in the back locker room. Only two such rings. Two colleagues were talking near the lockers, laughing at something that had happened at one of the tables. The sound of their laughter arrived, muffled, from another world. Tiwa opened her locker, took her bag, and stood still for a moment, holding the zipper without closing it. Adebisi Bello had never told the story of the ring. Tiwa had asked over the years. As a child with the naive curiosity of someone who finds everything beautiful, and as a young woman with the insistence of someone who begins to understand that silence protects something, the answer was always the same, spoken with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "This ring has a story that I will tell you one day, my daughter. One day, always one day." Tiwa grew up learning not to ask anymore. She grew up understanding that certain doors, when one's own mother does not open them, exist for a reason, and there is a kind of love that respects the secrets of those we love most, even when those secrets weigh heavily. But now there was a man with the twin ring of her mother's ring, in flesh and blood, sitting 10 feet away from her on a random night. And he knew Bisi's name, without Tiwa having given her last name, without having given any information other than her first name. He heard Bisi and froze like someone getting a shock. Outside the Orchid Terrace, Lagos went on with its indifferent rhythm. Tiwa walked to the bus stop with her hands buried in the pockets of her jacket. The night was cool, that dry, harmatangent-like chill that dries the lips and makes one walk faster without realizing. She, on the contrary, walked slowly. She needed to think. The yellow Danfo bus arrived, noisy and full. She boarded, stood holding onto the metal bar, and the entire ride was a silent conversation with herself. Who is Babajide Alao? The name had come out naturally during the dinner, spoken by one of the other men at the table. Jide, white hair, stone ring, a voice too controlled to belong to someone with a simple life. Clothes without ostentation, but with that discreet quality that screams without opening its mouth. Hands that had done hard work at some point in life. Eyes that carried something Tiwa could not name, but recognized because she had grown up seeing the same weight in her mother's eyes. The bus stopped, and she got off. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building without an elevator, in a neighborhood where the streets were uneven and windows stayed open late because of the Lagos heat. Tiwa climbed the stairs slowly, hearing her own breathing, preparing herself, without knowing exactly for what. Bisi was awake. She was always awake when Tiwa arrived late. She would stay on the sofa with a small reading lamp lit, or in the kitchen warming something up, or sitting on the tiny balcony that faced the external corridor of the tenement building. The illness had changed many things, her walk, her fatigue, the medications that occupied half the kitchen counter, but it had not changed this. Her mother was always awake when her daughter arrived. That night, Bisi was in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a mug of hot tea between her hands, her gaze lost in nothingness. In that way she had sometimes. It was not visible sadness. It was depth, as if she were present in body, but her mind was sailing somewhere no one else could reach, and the ring was there on her right hand, on the ring finger, the stone catching the dim kitchen light. Tiwa stopped at the entrance, looked at the ring, looked at her mother, and felt for the first time in her life that those two images, her mother's ring and the stranger's ring, were not a coincidence. They had never been. Mom? BC looked up, smiling with that tired, genuine smile that only exists on the face of someone who loves without reservation. You are late today. It was busy. Tiva placed her bag on the chair and stood up. Mom, can I ask you something? When you make that face, the question is never simple, BC said, but her tone was gentle, without reproach. Tiva sat at the table, looked directly at the ring, and then directly at her mother. Tonight, at the restaurant, I served a man white hair, a man of a certain age. His name is Babajide Alao. BC did not move, but the mug of tea froze in the air halfway between the table and her mouth, remaining suspended there, as if time had frozen around those three words. Babajide Alao. Mom. The mug descended slowly. BC placed it on the table with excessive care. The kind of care one takes when one needs to do something with one's hands, so the rest of the body does not betray what it is feeling. He had a ring, Tiva continued, her eyes fixed on her mother's face. An amber stone, a silver band with carvings, exactly like yours. And he told me that only 2 of these exist in the world. The silence that took over the kitchen was different from all the silences Tiva had lived in that apartment, and she had lived through many. The silence after the news of the diagnosis, the silence of the early hours when pain would not let her mother sleep, the silence of those mornings when they both pretended everything was fine, so as not to worry each other. This silence was different. It was the silence of a dam about to burst. Mom, Tiva said, her voice coming out smaller but gentle, without her having planned it. Who is Babajide Alao to you? BC closed her eyes. When she opened them, there was something in them Tiva had never seen. It was not just fatigue, nor just the physical pain that had accompanied her for so long. It was something else. It was the look of someone who had spent decades carrying a weight alone and had just realized that the time to lay it down had arrived. Not when she had planned, not how she had imagined, but it had arrived. Tiva, her mother said, her voice raspy, the way it got when emotion tightened her throat. There is a lot I needed to keep secret to protect myself and to protect you. I know, Mom. No, my daughter. BC shook her head slowly. You don't know. You don't know yet. And then her mother did something Tiva did not expect. She took the ring off her finger. For the first time in Tiwa's life, the ring came off her mother's finger. BC placed it on the table between them with the same care with which one sets down something fragile, something known to break at the wrong touch. This ring was given to me, BC said, by a man who swore he would find his way back to me, who promised that nothing would separate us. Her voice faltered for a second, but she did not stop, and who never came. Tiva looked at the ring on the table, at her mother's hand, now without it, which looked different, lighter and emptier at the same time. But Tiva, BC continued, and tears flowed without drama, silent, just gravity doing its work. Someone made sure he would never know where to find me. The kitchen became completely still. Tiva felt her own heart beat at an abnormal pace. It was not the racing of fear, but of understanding. The feeling that the ground which had always been beneath her feet was made of a material she had never examined closely, and now she was examining it and discovering it was different from everything she had imagined. Mom, she said, her voice carrying a fragility that rarely inhabited her. He was there tonight, and when I said your name, he froze. Did he know you? BC put her hand to her mouth. Her shoulders shook once, just once, before she steadied herself with that silent strength Tiva admired and had never quite known how to name. Decades, BC whispered. Decades, Tiva. I know. You don't know. Her mother looked at her, and in that look was a mixture of pain and decision that Tiva would recognize until the end of her life. You don't know yet, but you will, because if he is here. BC looked at the ring on the table, the amber stone shining under the dim kitchen light. Our time has come, and I no longer have the strength to hold this alone. Tiva placed her hand over her mother's. Neither of them said anything for a long time, and the ring remained there between them, on the small kitchen table, carrying a story that spanned decades, that survived separation and pain and silence, which waited patiently for the moment when a daughter, working in a luxury restaurant, would bring a glass of water and look at a hand she knew, without knowing she knew it. Outside, the city slept, but in that kitchen, something had woken up, and when it woke up fully, it would never go back to sleep. BC did not start at the beginning. People who carry heavy stories rarely start at the beginning. They start where it hurts least, with some peripheral detail, with the thinnest thread of the yarn, and pull slowly, like someone removing a bandage, stuck to a wound, knowing it will hurt, but needing it to hurt to finally heal. She started with the town. I grew up in a small town in the interior, BC said, her voice low, her eyes fixed on the ring still resting on the table between them. One of those places where everyone knows everyone's name, where news travels faster than people, and where certain families carry a weight you feel even before you understand why. Tiwa said nothing. She stayed quiet with that ability she had developed over the years, the ability not to interrupt her mother when she finally opened a door that had been shut for too long. The Aloud family was one of those, BC continued. Land, cattle, businesses. No one fully understood, but everyone respected. The father was a dry man, of few words and many decisions. The mother was elegant in that old-fashioned way that looks like kindness but is actually distance. She paused. And there were two sons, Dele, the older one, and Jide. The name landed in the kitchen air like a stone thrown into still water. I worked in a small textile workshop near their estate, BC said. It wasn't the best life, but it was honest, and it was mine. The corner of her mouth sketched something that didn't quite become a smile. Jide would appear sometimes, not to buy anything. He would appear and stand, talking through the window of the counter, as if he had all the time in the world and no more important place to be. Tiwa imagined the scene involuntarily. Her young mother behind a counter and a young man appearing not for the fabric, but for the person selling it. We got to know each other slowly, her mother continued. Without rush, the way good things usually grow quiet and firm, without warning. Her voice thinned for a second. He was different from what I expected of someone from his family. He had no arrogance. He asked things with real curiosity, listened truly, and laughed with that laugh that made it seem he had forgotten for a moment that he had responsibilities. The mug of tea cooled completely. Neither of them noticed. The ring, BC said, looking at the piece on the table. It was his idea. He knew an artisan in the neighboring town of Bida, an old man who worked with stones and metals in a way no one else did. Jide arrived one day with the two rings in a wooden box and said they were identical, because what existed between us was unique, and he wanted us to carry that, one on each of our fingers, as a reminder. Tiwa's eyes burned. She blinked slowly. He said he was going to speak to his father, that he would sort things out, that there was a way to resolve everything, and that I needed to trust him. BC's voice wavered for the first time, and I trusted him. I trusted him with everything I had. What happened, Mom? BC took a deep breath, the kind of breath that is not calm, but preparation. He vanished. The simplicity of the sentence was more devastating than any elaboration could be. From one day to the next, BC said, no letter, no messages, nothing. The textile workshop closed weeks later because the owner decided to move. I went looking for answers and found none that made sense. People said the Aloud family had left for Lagos because of business, that Jide had stayed behind to resolve some matters, and then followed, but he never appeared. She closed her eyes for an instant, and I was already carrying you. The silence that descended on the kitchen had physical weight. Tiwa felt as if the air had become denser, harder to breathe. You were pregnant? Tiwa said, not as a question, but like someone hearing the click of a lock finally opening. I didn't know yet when he disappeared, BC replied. I found out later. Alone, without work, without any answers. Her voice no longer trembled. There was a firmness there that only exists in someone who has already wept until dry, leaving only pure structure. I took the ring, took the little I had, and left. I came here, built what I could build. I raised you the way I knew how, with what was most real inside me. Tiwa's hands were covered by her mother's, without her having noticed when it happened. Why did you never tell me? She asked. And her voice came out without accusation, only with the gentle ache of someone who had always felt there was a locked room inside her own history. Because I didn't know if I would ever have an answer to give you, along with it, BC said. To tell you half without knowing the other half was to hand you a pain without resolution. I preferred to carry it myself until I had something whole to offer. Tiwa wiped her face with the back of her hand. And you never tried to find him? I tried once. When you were just a few years old, I sent a letter to the address someone gave me in Lagos. BC made a pause that carried decades inside it. The letter returned with a note on the envelope saying the addressee had moved and left no forwarding address. Or someone returned it before it reached him, Tiwa said. And there was a hardness in her voice that was not anger at her mother, but anger at the situation, at the coldness of someone who decides the destiny of two people, like moving pieces on a board. BC did not answer, but her expression said her daughter was not wrong. It was then that Tiwa stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the external corridor without seeing anything, because what she was seeing was another place, another scene. A white-haired man at a restaurant table, his hand motionless on the linen tablecloth, his face changing at the sound of a simple name, BC. He had not frozen from surprise. He had frozen from recognition. The kind of recognition that hurts because it confirms that what we tried to leave behind never truly went away. "Mom," Tiwa said without turning around. He didn't know. I am sure he didn't know. Tiwa. The way he looked when I said your name. She turned. It wasn't the look of someone who chose to leave. It was the look of someone who lost something and never came to terms with the loss. BC looked at her daughter for a long moment, and in that look was a silent war between the woman who had learned to survive without answers and the woman who, deep down, had never stopped wanting them. "And now?" her mother asked in a voice so quiet it barely reached the other side of the table. Tiwa walked back, sat down, took the ring from the table, and carefully placed it back on her mother's hand, finger by finger, slowly, like someone returning something that should never have left its place. "Now," she said, "I need to find out what really happened, because if someone separated you on purpose, that person had to act, and whoever acts leaves a trail." BC looked at the ring back on her finger. The amber stone shone, and for the first time in decades, something in the face of Tiwa's mother shifted. It was not hope yet. It was something more fragile than that. It was the crack in a wall that someone spends years believing to be solid, only to discover that underneath was a window waiting to be opened. Outside, the early morning advanced in silence, but inside that kitchen, a daughter had just taken on a mission no one had asked of her, and which only she could fulfill. Babajide Alao did not sleep that night. He arrived at the apartment he kept in Lagos, spacious, discreet, with the impersonality of someone who spends more time in transit than at home, and sat in the living room armchair with the lights off, not for drama, but because certain things must be faced in the dark, where there is no distraction, where the only place to look is inward. BC Bello. The name returned with a clarity that should not have been possible after so much time, like a song one hasn't heard in decades that suddenly plays somewhere, and the entire body remembers before the mind processes it. The rhythm, the lyrics, the smell of the place where he heard it for the first time. He looked at his own ring. He had never taken it off. In all these years, in every situation, board meetings, international trips, moments when it would have been simpler and more convenient to put it away in a drawer and pretend it was just an old piece of jewelry with no history, the ring had remained. People asked sometimes. He would answer with something vague about family craftsmanship, and the subject would die there. But the truth was simpler and heavier than any explanation. Taking off the ring would mean accepting that he had lost, and there was a part of Babajide Alao that always refused to accept that. The waitress. He closed his eyes and reconstructed her face with the attention of someone looking for something specific. Tiwa. She had said her own name when she introduced herself at the start of service, as was restaurant protocol. Tiwa Bello. The eyes that had something familiar he couldn't place at the time, that uncomfortable feeling of recognizing a face without knowing from where, the way she held her posture even after asking a question that clearly left her vulnerable. The firmness in her voice when she spoke, that firmness which is not boldness, but a spine created by necessity. My mother has one exactly like it. Bello, BC Bello. Jide opened his eyes in the dark. His heart beat with a heavy slowness, like an old water pump that still works but requires effort for each cycle. He needed to think. He needed to think carefully, with order, with the discipline he had spent decades developing in business, and which he now tried to apply to something that did not obey any logic of spreadsheets or contracts. Decades ago, when he returned to the town after a business trip that had lasted longer than expected, BC had disappeared, not from the whole town. The textile workshop where she worked had closed. That was a fact. The owner had indeed moved, but BC had too. No one knew where, or no one wanted to say. At the time, with the naivety of someone who did not yet understand that not all silence is innocent, Jide had believed she had decided to start over elsewhere. It had been painful. It had been the kind of pain that doesn't scream, but just occupies space, quiet, permanent, installed in a corner of the chest where one learns not to touch. But never, at any moment in all those years, had he considered the possibility that someone had acted so she would leave, or so he would never find her. Jide passed his hand over his face and, for the first time in decades, felt there was a question that needed to be asked. A question that should have been asked much sooner, but which life had buried under business, decisions, an existence that kept functioning even with that hole in the center. And that question had a name, Dele. The next morning, early, Jide's phone rang. It was Funmilayo Coker. "You disappeared at the end of the meeting yesterday?" she said, without preamble, with the direct objectivity that was her trademark. "The other two were waiting for your position on the land in the north. We need to close this week." "I know," Jide said. Are you all right? A pause. I am. Funmi Koka had known Jeet for many years. She was the managing partner of the holding company they ran together, a woman of quick thinking, precise vocabulary, and an impressive capacity to identify when something was out of place. She had built her own career from scratch, without a family name or inheritance, and perhaps because of that, she understood Jide in a way few people could. Jide, she said, and her tone had shifted slightly, becoming less executive and more human. What happened last night at that restaurant? Silence. The others mentioned that you stopped in the middle of the meeting because of a waitress, she continued. That you spent several minutes without speaking, that when the meeting resumed, you were somewhere else. Fun me. I won't go where I'm not invited, she said before he could finish. I just want to know if you need anything. Jeed looked out the window. The city was beginning to move outside with the daily rush of those who have commitments, deadlines, obligations. The external world functioning in its exact rhythm, completely indifferent to the fact that the previous night had stirred up something he thought he had learned to keep hidden. I need an address, he said. Tiwa arrived at work that afternoon carrying in her eyes the unmistakable sign of someone who had not slept enough. It was not just physical fatigue, but that specific weariness of when the head does not turn off because there are too many questions competing for space. She changed into her uniform, tied her hair, and took a deep breath in front of the small locker room mirror. In the morning, before leaving, she had sat on the edge of her mother's bed, while Bisi was still asleep. She looked at her face, the marks that time and illness had drawn, her hands on the sheet, the stone ring back in its place, and felt with an uncomfortable clarity how much her mother had aged recently. Not suddenly, but slowly, in that treacherous way that makes us not notice because we are too close. The illness was advancing. The medications occupying the kitchen counter had increased in recent weeks. The visits to Evercare Clinic, a modest but competent clinic, where the doctor overseeing Bisi was a serious man who never sugar-coated realities, had become more frequent. The previous week, the doctor had requested new tests with a discreet urgency that Tiwa had learned to translate. We need quick answers meant that time was no longer infinite. It was this thought that accompanied her now as she organized the tables for the afternoon shift. There was an impossible equation forming in her head. Her mother was running against an invisible clock, and there was a man somewhere in this city who perhaps did not even know she existed. Tiwa, the voice of the maître de mystère, Kolawala, an older man with sparse white hair, who managed the dining room of the Orchid Terrace, with the precision of someone treating it as sacred, sounded from across the room. There is someone at the entrance asking for you. Tiwa raised her eyes. For me? By name? Ask specifically for the waitress, Tiwa. She crossed the dining room with a calm she did not feel inside, pushing open the glass door at the entrance. Babajide Alao was standing outside. There was no business suit this time. Simple trousers, a shirt open at the collar, without the formality of the previous night. He seemed smaller this way, not physically, but stripped of the armor that the business environment builds around people. There was something almost vulnerable in the way he stood there at a restaurant entrance, waiting for a young woman he barely knew. I should have asked for your contact yesterday, he said before she could open her mouth. Forgive me for showing up like this. I didn't know any other way. Tiwa stood still, studying the man in front of her with that attention. Her mother also had the attention of those who have learned that people reveal more in what they do not say than in what they say. Can I have 5 minutes? He asked. She looked back at Mr. Kolavole, who was watching discreetly from the dining room entrance. The old maître de made an almost imperceptible gesture with his head. You can. Tiwa stepped out. They stood in a side area of the restaurant, an open corridor with potted plants that separated the terrace from the neighboring building. A place without glamour, nothing to do with the internal environment, but it was private, and that was what mattered. How is Madame Bisi? Jeed asked. The question came direct, without beating around the bush, without the diplomatic construction a less honest person would use, and there was in it a contained urgency that dissolved half the mistrust Tiwa had brought with her. Why do you want to know? She replied, not with coldness, but with the caution of someone protecting something precious. Because I spent the whole night thinking, he said, and I reached a conclusion that gives me no rest. What conclusion? Jide looked at his own hands for a moment. The ring caught a sliver of afternoon light. When he looked up, there was something in his eyes that Tiwa recognized because she had seen it on her mother's face in the kitchen the night before. It was the expression of someone about to say something that cannot be undone afterward. I never left, he said. You need to know that before anything else. I never chose to leave and leave your mother behind. When I returned from a trip and she was no longer there, I searched. For a long time, I searched, but someone had erased the tracks with a competence that I, at the time, did not know how to question. Tiwa felt her breathing change. "And why are you telling me this?" "Because the waitress who served my table yesterday has the same eyes I see in the mirror," he said, and his voice faltered exactly on the last word, only on it, before he recovered. "And I need to know if I am seeing what I think I am seeing, or if I am just seeing what I want to see, because of a guilt I have carried for too long." The corridor became quiet. Inside the restaurant, the muffled sound of dishes and conversations continued its oblivious rhythm. Outside, the city went on. Here, in this corridor of pots and unadorned walls, two people stood before a truth that did not yet have an official name, but which both already felt. "My mother is ill," Tiwa said, and the words came out with a hardness that was not directed at him. It was the kind of hardness we use as armor when the matter is too big. The treatment is expensive. I work here and another shift somewhere else. She has never asked anything of anyone in her life, never opened a door she didn't open with her own hands, and she spent decades keeping a secret that clearly cost her a lot. Jide listened without interrupting, with that dense attention she had noticed the previous night. "So if you are here," Tiwa continued, "I need it to be for a true reason. I cannot deal with another disappointment for my mother. She does not have time to recover from disappointments." The last sentence hung in the air with a weight they both felt in the same way. "I understand," Jide said with a quietness that was not submission, but respect. "And I am not here to cause pain. I am here because last night, for the first time in many years, I felt there was a chance to understand what happened. And if there is that chance, I no longer have the age or the patience to ignore it." Tiwa stood looking at him for a long moment. She was evaluating him not with groundless suspicion, but with the seriousness of someone who knows that a wrong decision at this moment does not affect only her. "There is a person," she said finally, "whom my mother mentioned yesterday. Someone she thinks may have acted to separate you." She didn't say it with certainty, but the name hung in the air in a way that wasn't casual. Jide did not blink. Dele. It was not a question. And the fact that the name had reached him before Tiwa even pronounced it said more than any verbal confirmation could. "My older brother," Jide said, and for the first time since he arrived, there was something different in his voice. It was not anger yet. It was the start of understanding that exact moment when the mind begins to rearrange old memories under a new light, and what seemed meaningless begins, piece by piece, to fit in a way that hurts. There were things he said at the time, comments about Beezy, about what would or wouldn't be appropriate. I didn't give it the weight it deserved because I thought it was just his way. Well, if it wasn't just his way, then it means I ignored signs that were there the whole time, he said. And that is a reckoning I will have to settle with myself. Tiwa took a deep breath. My mother does not know you came here. I know, and she doesn't need to know yet, he said. Not until there is something concrete. She does not deserve a hope that might not be confirmed. And there in that charmless corridor, Tiwa felt for the first time since the night before that there was someone on the other side who understood the weight of what was at stake, who was not treating it as a curious story or a personal score to settle, that beneath the composure, the white hair, and the years of distance was a man who had also carried a loss. How do I get in touch with you? She asked. Jide took a simple card from his pocket, just his name and a number. No title, no company, no ostentation. She looked at the card, and then at him. I will speak with my mother, Tiwa said. When she is ready, I will call. Take all the time you need, he replied. But as he turned to leave, he stopped. He stood with his back, turned for a second, like someone who forgot something, and is deciding whether to go back or not. And then he said, without turning around fully, his voice coming over his shoulder, does she still wear the ring? Tiwa looked at the card in her hand. She never took it off, she answered. In all these years, she never took it off. Jide stood still for an instant that lasted longer than it should have. Then he nodded once, slowly, the gesture of someone who has just received information that transforms something inside without making a sound, and left. Tiwa stood in the corridor until his footsteps faded. Then she looked at the card again. Then she looked at the imaginary ring on her own finger, the ring her mother never took off, which crossed decades of silence, pain, and forced beginnings, which waited. There was, in that silent waiting of a piece of silver with an amber stone, more fidelity than in many words the world speaks aloud. Tiwa slipped the card into her uniform pocket and went back inside. She had a shift to complete, tables to serve, glasses to fill, smiles to measure. The work that paid for her mother's medicines, that kept the lights on in the third-floor apartment, that sustained the two of them while the world kept turning, careless of the stories happening inside small kitchens. But beneath all of that, quiet and firm as a root no one sees, A decision had been made. She was going to find Dele Alao and discover what he had done. Finding Dele Alao was not difficult. People with old money and a need for control rarely hide. They display themselves in specific, carefully selected places where the power they carry can be seen by the right people. The name Alao appeared in chambers of commerce, on the boards of agricultural associations, in old photographs of charity events where men in suits smiled for cameras, with the comfort of those who never had to worry about what appeared in the portrait. Tiwa spent days gathering fragments. She had no access to sophisticated tools or influential contacts. She had what she always had: persistence, attention to detail, and the ability to ask questions without seeming to ask questions. She spoke to an older colleague at the Orchid Terrace who knew half of Lagos. She searched through public records available in a municipal library that smelled of old paper and operated with a slowness that tested any patience. She cross-referenced information with the naturalness of someone solving a practical problem, because that was exactly what she was doing. What she found about Dele painted a portrait that did not surprise but confirmed. Older than Jeed by a few years, Dele Alao had assumed the family businesses after their father's passing. He expanded, diversified, and built around the Alao name a structure that mixed land, commerce, and regional influence, with the skill of someone who understands that true power does not need a spotlight, it needs roots. He was married, had adult children, and had frequented the same circles for decades. An apparently solid life, built brick by brick, on a foundation Tiwa now suspected was rotten at a specific point. The address was no secret. Dele maintained an office in a neighboring town, the same small town in the interior where BC had worked in the textile workshop, where the two rings had a history, where everything had begun and been interrupted. Tiwa did not go alone. She had not planned to tell Funmi, but when Jeed's partner called her, having obtained her number through Jeed himself, with the direct explanation that I need to talk to you before you do something without enough information, Tiwa listened to what the woman had to say. Funmi Koka spoke with the objectivity of someone presenting facts, not opinions. She said she had known Jeed long enough to understand that what had happened that night at the restaurant was no ordinary episode, that she had seen the man go through difficult situations with a stability that sometimes seemed superhuman, and that for the first time she had seen something different in him, not weakness, but the exposure of something that had been kept hidden for too long. He didn't tell me the details, Funmi said over the phone, but he asked me to help you if you needed it, and I think you will. Why? Tiwa asked. Because Dele Alao is not the kind of man who receives unexpected visits without reacting, and you are going to show up there without warning, without backing, with nothing but questions he won't want to answer. A pause. How do you know I am going to show up there? Because you have Jeed's eyes, Funmi said, with a simplicity that was not flattery, but a diagnosis. And he also never waited to have enough backing to do what needed to be done. It's genetic, apparently. Tiwa remained silent for a moment. Are you going to accompany me? She said. Indeed, I am already in the car, Funmi replied. Dele Alao's office was on the upper floor of an old two-story building in the center of the neighboring town. A stone facade, high windows, the kind of construction that ages with dignity because it was made to last. A discreet plaque beside the door indicated only the name and activity: Administration of Agricultural Properties. Funmi was a woman in her mid-40s, with a straight posture and a gaze that evaluated everything without showing that she was evaluating. Tiwa immediately recognized her as the kind of person who enters a room and silently changes the weight of the environment, not by intimidation, but by presence. You speak, Funmi said as they climbed the stairs. I observe. If he starts to close up, I step in. Tiwa nodded. The secretary, a middle-aged woman with an efficient expression, informed them that Mr. Dele was in a meeting. Funmi handed over a card with the name of the holding company and said, with a politeness that had steel underneath, that they would wait. They waited less than expected. Dele Alao appeared at the door of the inner office, with the expression of someone who had been interrupted and was measuring whether the interruption justified his patience. He was a man of heavy build, with closely cropped grey hair, and large hands that betrayed a life that had not started behind a desk. His face had that specific hardness of someone who had spent decades making decisions that affected other people, and had developed over time the ability not to think too much about it. When he saw Funmi, he recognized the name on the card. It was impossible to be in the circles they frequented without knowing the Alao Holding Company's associates. His gaze adjusted with calculated caution. When he saw Tiwa, his gaze did something different, something that lasted only a second, too fast to be intentional, a minimal twitch around the eyes, an almost imperceptible adjustment in posture. The kind of reaction the body produces when it recognizes something, the mind is still deciding how to handle. "What a pleasure," he said with a cordiality that was correct in all external details and completely wrong in everything underneath. "Please, come in." The office had dark wooden bookshelves reaching to the ceiling, a robust desk in the center, and 2 leather chairs on the opposite side. Dele sat on his own side, Funmi and Tiwa on the other. The setup was that of a business meeting, and that seemed to be exactly what Dele intended to maintain control of the frame. "To what do I owe this visit?" he asked, his eyes going from one to the other, with that distributed attention of someone who wants to seem open but is, in truth, reading them. "My name is Tiwa Bello," she said. "I am the daughter of BC Bello." The silence that followed lasted exactly the right amount of time to say everything Dele did not say. He did not ask who BC was, nor did he furrow his brow like someone searching his memory. He did not make any of the natural gestures of someone hearing an unfamiliar name. He remained still, just still. And this non-movement was the most revealing answer he could have given. "It is good that she is well," he said finally, in a voice that had lost a degree of its initial cordiality. "It has been a long time." "It has," Tiwa agreed. "Long enough for my mother to believe Jeed had chosen to leave. Long enough for her to raise a daughter alone without understanding the reason for the abandonment." She made a short pause. "Long enough for me to grow up without knowing who my father was." The word landed on the table like a stone thrown at glass. "Father," Dele did not move, but something in his eyes, something that was being kept in place with effort, yielded a fraction. "Tiwa," he said with a care that sounded like the distance of someone choosing his words, like someone choosing the ground where he is going to step. "There are many things you do not know about that time." "Then tell me," she replied with a calmness that cost her more than it appeared. "Because my mother is ill, and the time she has is real and limited. And I am not leaving here without understanding what happened." Funmi, beside her, said nothing, but Tiwa felt her presence like a solid support, the kind that does not need words to exist. Dele looked at his own hands on the table. They were the hands of an older man now, marked, a bit stiff, with that physical permanence that years impose on everything. When he looked up, there was something in them Tiwa did not expect. It was not denial. It was weariness, the weariness of carrying something for too long. "My father," Dele began, his voice lowering a tone without him seeming to notice, was a man who believed certain things had to be preserved. The family name, the position, the right alliances. He took a deep breath. When he found out about what was going on between Jeed and BC, he was not pleased. "Pleased enough to act," Tiwa said. "He was like that," Dele replied. "When he saw something he judged wrong for the family, he acted without discussion, without consultation. He acted and considered it resolved." "And you?" Tiwa asked, and there was a tense thread in her voice, that tension of someone who is one step away from something that will change the way they see the world. "Did you just watch?" The question hung in the air. Dele looked at her for a long moment, and Tiwa saw. She saw with the painful clarity of someone who had hoped the answer would be different, that his expression was not that of an innocent man who had merely witnessed it. It was that of a man who had participated, who had perhaps told himself for decades that there were sufficient reasons, who had perhaps found a way to frame what he did in a way that fit his own conscience. "I was younger," he said, "and I made a mistake." 3 words. Tiwa felt her throat tighten. "How did you make a mistake?" she asked, her voice coming out smaller. "BC had written a letter," Dele said, and now the words came out slowly, heavily, like someone removing something from a place where it had been compressed for a long time. "My father intercepted it, passed it to me, and asked me to handle it. He said Jide needed to be focused on more important things, that was a distraction." "And you returned the letter?" Tiwa said. "It was not a question. I returned it with a note, saying he had moved without leaving an address." The office became completely silent. Funmi, beside Tiwa, closed her eyes for a second, just one, then opened them, and her expression returned to its place. Tiwa did not close her eyes. She kept looking at Dele with a fixity that was not hatred, but something more complex. It was the look of someone processing in real time the equation of an entire life being rewritten by a 3-minute confession. A letter returned by a man who thought he had the right to rewrite the destiny of other people. "My mother waited," Tiwa said, her voice coming out with a firmness that cost every muscle in her face. "She waited for a man who was searching for her without knowing his search was being blocked. She raised a daughter alone, fell ill, and never had the answer she deserved." Dele did not answer. "And Jide," she continued, "did you never tell him?" "No." "Why?" A long pause, the longest of the meeting. Because at the beginning, I thought I had done the right thing, Daly said with a belated honesty that was both insufficient and necessary. And when I understood that I hadn't, too much time had passed, and I didn't know how to go back. Tiwa stood up, not with abruptness, but with that controlled slowness of someone who needs a moment not to let their internal weight leak out in a way they would regret later. My mother does not have time to wait for you to figure out how to go back, she said. But you have the obligation to look at Jide and tell him what you just told me, not to return anything to me, not to fix what can no longer be fixed, but because he spent decades carrying a loss you caused, and he deserves to know the truth. She turned to leave. Tiwa. Dele's voice came from behind, older, more broken than at any point in the previous conversation. She stopped, but did not turn around. You have my brother's eyes, he said. I always knew a daughter could exist. I always knew. And living with that was not simple. No, Tiwa replied without turning around, her hand on the doorknob. It was not simple for anyone, but the only person who lived with it without having chosen to was my mother. She opened the door and walked out. Funmi followed her in silence. They descended the stairs together, without saying a word. Only when they reached the sidewalk, under the afternoon sun of that town which held the beginning of everything, did Tiwa stop. She breathed once, twice. Funmi placed a hand on her shoulder for a second, a brief gesture, without words, which said exactly what needed to be said. Now, Tiwa said when her voice returned to its place, I need to call Jide. Jide answered on the second ring, as if he were waiting, as if he knew in some way that did not fit into any rational explanation that today would be different from other days. Tiwa, he said, just that. I need to speak with you, she replied. Not over the phone. A very brief pause. Tell me where you are. They met in a square in the center of the neighboring town, an open place, with wooden benches under ancient trees that cast generous shade over the stone pavement. Funmi stayed at a distance, sitting on a bench further away, giving them the space the situation required, without abandoning the presence she had promised. Jide arrived before Tiwa had finished crossing the square. He was standing, hands in his pockets, watching her walk toward him, with an expression she could not immediately classify, and only understood later, when everything had been said, the expression of someone about to hear something that will reorganize everything. They sat on the same bench. The afternoon sun filtered through the leaves above and drew irregular patterns on the ground. Around them, daily life went on: a child running, a couple walking slowly, pigeons contesting space near a fountain, the world completely oblivious to what was happening on that specific bench. I found Dele, Tiwa said without preamble. Jide did not show surprise. He only nodded once, like someone confirming something he had already calculated as a possibility. He confirmed it, she continued. My mother wrote a letter. Your father intercepted it and passed it to him to handle. Dele returned it with a false note, saying you had moved without leaving an address. The silence Jide kept after that was not the silence of who has nothing to say, but the silence of who has too much, and none of it fits into immediate words. Tiwa observed his profile, saw his jaw tighten, saw his hands, which were on his knees, slowly close and then open again. She saw his eyes, those eyes she had recognized in the mirror of her own history, fix themselves on some point ahead, which was not the square, nor the fountain, nor the pigeons, but the past. I searched for her, he said, his voice coming from a deep and controlled place. I returned from the trip and the workshop was closed. I asked at the shop next door. I asked at the chemist on the corner. I asked everyone I thought might know. No one knew anything, or no one wanted to say. A pause. When I went to speak with my father, he told me BC had decided to leave, that it was better this way, that I needed to concentrate on what mattered. And you believed him? Tiwa said, without judgment. I didn't want to believe, he replied, but I also didn't know how not to believe. I was younger, and there was a structure around me that was larger than my capacity to question at that moment. His voice faltered slightly, only on one syllable before firming up. That is a reckoning I pay with myself to this day. Tiwa looked at her own hands. There was a question that needed to be asked, the biggest of all, the one she had carried to this bench, since the night her mother took the ring off her finger for the first time. Jide, she said, and used his name without a title for the first time, without having planned it, because the moment had made any formality too small. Do you know what I have been trying to say since the beginning of this conversation? He turned to look at her, and in that look was an answer that preceded any word, an answer that had lived in him since the night at the restaurant, since the moment he saw her eyes and felt that recognition which had no address but had certainty. I know, he said. The word came out simple, whole, without beating around the bush. I needed to hear it from you, he completed, but I know. Tiwa felt something shift inside her. It was not relief. It was not joy. It was none of the emotions she had imagined for this moment during her recent sleepless nights. It was something more like the end of a very old tension, like when we carry a weight for so long that our muscles get used to it, and we only realize how heavy it was when we finally lay it down. "My mother does not know I came here," she said. "She doesn't know I found Dele. She doesn't know I am speaking with you now." "Why didn't you tell her?" "Because she spent her whole life protecting other people from difficult things," Tiwa replied. "Who is protecting her?" Jide stood looking at her for a moment that lasted longer than a moment, and in that look was something Tiwa would only be able to describe to herself much later on a quiet night. It was pride, the specific and devastating kind of pride that only exists when we see in another person a quality we deeply admire and discover at the same time that this person is ours. "How is she?" he asked, and his voice came out differently, exposed without the composure he had maintained until then. Tiwa took a second to answer, not because she didn't know what to say, but because what there was to say was heavy, and she needed an instant to choose to carry it the right way. "She is fighting," she said. "The illness advances slowly, but it advances. The medicines control it, but they don't resolve it. She wakes up every day and chooses to continue, and that costs more than any person from the outside can see." A pause. "But she is still the most whole person I know. The pain never broke what she is inside." Jide closed his eyes. When he opened them, there was something different in them. It was no longer just the weight of the past, but the urgency of the present, the clarity of someone who has just understood that time is not an infinite resource, and never was. But sometimes we need someone to say it to our face, for the truth to truly sink in. "I want to see her," he said. "I know," Tiwa replied, "but not if she doesn't want to, not if it will cause more pain than already exists." Tiwa looked at him, at his white hair, his large hands, the ring that had remained on his finger while decades passed, and the world changed, and two people carried each their own half of a story that never had a conclusion. "Let me speak with her first," she said, "in the right way, at the right time." Jide nodded. They sat in silence for a few moments. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two strangers who had just discovered they were not strangers, and were learning in real time what that meant. "Can I ask you something?" Tiwa said. "You can always." "Why did you never take off the ring?" Jide looked at the stone, catching the light filtered by the trees. He took his time to answer, not because he was choosing his words, but because he was being honest. And honesty sometimes needs space to organize itself, because taking off the ring would be saying that it hadn't been real. He answered finally, "And it was the most real thing I have ever lived." A short pause. No achievement that came after, no successful business, no right decision filled that space. "I learned to live with it empty, but I never pretended it was full." Tiwa felt her throat tighten with that specific pressure that precedes tears, and held it. It was not the time. Later, when she was alone, when she could let it out without needing to be strong. She stood up from the bench. "I will call you," she said, using a more familiar tone for the first time too, with the same involuntary naturalness as before, as if her tongue knew something her head was still assimilating. Jide stood up too, rising to his full height, that figure, that mixed weight, weariness, and a dignity that the years had not erased. "Tiwa," he said. She stopped. "Thank you for not giving up on searching." A pause. "I wouldn't have had the courage to do what you did." Tiwa looked at him for a long second. "You did," she replied. "You just waited longer than you should have, and then you went." She crossed the square back, feeling the sun on her neck and the weight of everything that had happened on that simple wooden bench. Behind her, she knew without looking. Jide remained standing, watching her go with that immobility of someone storing a scene so as not to forget it. Funmi reached her in the middle of the square, walking beside her without asking anything. Only when they reached the car did Tiwa speak. "She needs to know," she said. "Today." Funmi put the key in the ignition. "Then let's go," she replied. Tiwa arrived home before nightfall. She climbed the stairs of the building slowly, not from physical fatigue, but because each step carried the weight of what was about to happen. She had rehearsed the conversation in the car while Funmi drove in silence, with that ability to recognize when the most useful presence is the one that does not interfere. She had constructed sentences, chosen words, planned pauses, and as she laid her hand on the doorknob, she realized that nothing of what she had rehearsed would serve. Certain conversations do not fit into rehearsals. Bisi was on the tiny balcony, sitting in the wicker chair that had survived 3 moves and 2 decades, with a thin shawl over her shoulders and her gaze lost in the direction of the external corridor. The amberstone ring caught the last fragments of the afternoon light, She turned when she heard the door. She read her daughter's face before Tiwa opened her mouth. Because a mother reads her child like that with her eyes, with her whole body, with that antenna that does not need an explicit signal. What is it? Bisi said, in that voice that had become thinner with the passing of time, more careful, as if her body knew it needed to save energy. Tiwa pulled up the small chair that was leaned against the wall and sat facing her mother, so close that her knees almost touched Bisi's. She took her hands, those hands that had sewn, washed, cooked, healed, and built an entire life without asking anyone for help. "Mom," she said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear everything before you answer." Bisi remained quiet, nodded, and Tiwa told her about the days of research, about Funmi, about the office with the stone facade in the neighboring town. She told her about Dele, sitting on the other side of a robust desk, about the expression he made when he heard the name Bisi, that non-movement that revealed everything before any word. She told her about the letter, about the false note, about Jeed's father who had ordered it handled, and the older brother who had obeyed, thinking he was doing the right thing. She told her about the square, about Jeed standing, waiting before she crossed the entire path, about what he said regarding the ring. It was the most real thing I have ever lived. Bisi did not interrupt once. She listened with that immobility of someone receiving something too large to process in motion. Tiwa's hands, covering hers, remained still. Also, 2 generations stopped in time, while decades of silence were undone word by word. When Tiwa finished, the only sound on the balcony was the warm wind rising from the corridor, carrying the smell of food from some neighboring flat and the distant sound of the city that did not stop. "He never left," Bisi said. It was not a question. It was a woman recalculating an equation she had carried wrong for an entire life. "Never," Tiwa confirmed. Bisi closed her eyes, and what happened on her face at that moment was the kind of thing that has no precise name. It was not joy. It was too early for that, and there was too much pain in the way for joy to arrive clean. It was not simple relief. It was deeper, older. It was the face of a woman who had spent decades carrying the silent conviction that she had been abandoned, and who had just discovered that this conviction was a lie, that the love she had kept as a relic of something that ended was, in truth, the relic of something that never had the chance to continue. A tear fell, then another, without a sob, without drama, just gravity doing its work on eyes that had already wept for that many times, but never with this explanation. "My whole life," she whispered. "I thought it had been too little, that there was something in me that was not enough to make him stay." "Mom," Tiwa said, her voice coming out broken. "Let it be," Bisi said, squeezing her daughter's hands. "It is not sadness. It is like removing a thorn that stayed buried deep for so long that we forgot it hurt until it came out." They stayed like that for a time, the tiny balcony containing something that was larger than the space. Then Bisi opened her eyes and looked at her daughter with that firmness that the illness had made more visible, not less, as if, in stripping away all that was superfluous, what remained was only the essential. And the essential in Bisi Bello had always been strength. "He wants to see me," she said. It was also not a question. "He does. And you?" Bisi tilted her head slightly. "What do you want, my daughter?" Tiwa took a second, not because she didn't know, but because the answer deserved to be spoken with care. "I want you to have the answer you deserve to receive a long time ago," she said. "The rest we will learn." Bisi looked at the ring, ran her thumb over the amber stone with that gesture Tiwa had seen 1,000 times over her life, automatic, almost unconscious, as if her hand sought that specific texture when her heart needed to anchor itself in something. "Set it for tomorrow," she said. Jeed arrived punctually. Tiwa was waiting for him at the entrance of the building. When she saw him step out of the car, that figure with white hair who had started everything on a night of crystal chandeliers and aligned glasses, she felt something she hadn't felt in any of their previous meetings. Nervousness. Not for herself, but for the two of them. For the woman upstairs who had spent the morning fixing her hair 3 times, changing her blouse twice, and saying she wasn't nervous while her hands contradicted her with every movement. Jeed stopped in front of Tiwa. He was different from that day in the square, not in appearance, but in something internal. Something that had lowered a degree in the direction of vulnerability, as if he had spent the night dismantling armor he didn't know he still wore. "Does she know everything?" he asked. "Everything?" Tiwa confirmed. He nodded, breathed, looked at the facade of the building like someone looking at a height they are going to climb, and is measuring with honesty if they have the preparation they need. "Let's go," Tiwa said. They climbed the stairs in silence. 3 flights, each step weighing differently on the feet of each. When they reached the door of the flat, Tiwa put the key in the lock, opened it, and took a step back. "She is in the living room," she said, and stayed outside. Jide looked at her, a question in his eyes. "It belongs to you two," Tiwa said, with a simplicity that resolved everything. "I am here." BC was sitting on the sofa. She had chosen the place with the silent care of someone who thinks of every detail without admitting she is thinking of it. The light from the window arrived from the right angle. Her shawl was folded beside her, not over her shoulders, because she had decided not to appear more fragile than she felt, even if the fragility was real. When the door opened and Jide entered, she did not stand up immediately. She remained still, looking at him, and he remained still, looking at her. There were decades in that space between the two of them, decades of lives lived in different directions, of choices made without having all the information, of pains that remained without explanation for too long. There was a young woman from a textile workshop, and a young man who appeared not for the fabric, and a wooden box with 2 rings, and a promise spoken with the conviction of someone who still believes the world works the way it should. And there was also, beneath all of that, something that time had not managed to erase, because certain things do not erase. They remain quiet, deep, permanent, like roots. BC stood up slowly. Jide crossed the room. There was no speech. There was no long, elaborate sentence that any conventional script would place there. There were only 2 human beings who met in the middle of a small room, in a 3rd-floor flat without an elevator, and stood facing each other with the full weight of everything that had been lost and everything that was still there. "BC," he said, and the voice came from the deepest place a voice can come. She did not answer with words. She placed her hand on his face, the hand with the ring, the hand that had carried that stone for decades, and his hand came to cover hers, and the two remained like that. Jide closed his eyes. His shoulders, which had sustained his controlled posture for all those years, lowered an inch, just one, in a minimal and devastating surrender of the composure he had maintained as his final defense. "I searched," he said, his voice faltering on the last word. "I know," she replied. "Tiwa told me. I didn't know about the letter. I swear I didn't know." "I know," BC repeated. And there was in her tone something that was forgiveness, not the easy forgiveness of those who forget, but the hard and real forgiveness of those who understand that life is complicated and people make mistakes, and holding on to grudges for things the other person didn't do serves no one. A tear fell down Jide's face, just one, the kind of tear that takes an entire life to arrive. BC wiped it with her thumb, with that gentle gesture of someone caring, with that gesture she had made countless times on her daughter's face over the years, and which she now made on someone who had been lost and had been found. Sentáronse juntos on the sofa, talking for hours. Outside, on the balcony, Tiwa sat in her mother's wicker chair and looked out at the external corridor with the same absent gaze she had seen so many times on BC's face. She understood now what that gaze was. It was not sadness. It was the place where a person goes when they are processing something too large for the visible world. Sometimes the sound of their voices reached her low, impossible to understand the words, but with a rhythm she recognized. It was the rhythm of two people who have a lot to say and are discovering that time, even if limited, still exists. When Jide left, the afternoon had turned into night. He passed by the balcony before going, stopping beside Tiwa, who stood up instinctively. His face was different, there was no other way to describe it. It was different, as if something that had remained tense inside had finally found where to land. "She told me about the treatment," he said, "about the medicines, about the consultations." Tiwa did not answer, waiting. "I want to help," he said, and raised his hand before she could speak. Not as a favor, not as compensation, as someone who was absent involuntarily and who is now present and wants that presence to mean something real. Tiwa looked at him for a moment. "She will need more tests," she said finally. "The doctor requested them with urgency. They are expensive. Schedule them," he replied. "Everything that is needed." She nodded, not with the ease of someone accepting help without weight, but with the maturity of someone who understands that misplaced pride is a luxury certain situations do not allow. "Jide," she said when he was about to go. He turned. "Thank you for keeping the ring." He stood still for a second, and what passed across his face in that instant was the kind of expression that is not described, only kept. "It was the least I could do," he answered. "It was the only way I knew how to say I hadn't given up." And he went down the stairs. Tiwa went back inside. She found her mother still on the sofa, with a look different from that of the morning. No longer the look of someone carrying something undefined, but the look of someone who had just laid down a weight they didn't even know they were still holding. She sat beside her, saying nothing. BC took her daughter's hand. "Do you know what he told me?" BC spoke after a long silence. "What?" That the thing he regretted most in life was not that he didn't search more. He regretted that he didn't question when there was still time, that he accepted an answer that made no sense, just because it came from someone he thought had authority. Tiwa remained in silence, processing. "And do you know what I thought when he said that?" BC continued. "What, Mum?" BC turned to her daughter, and there was in her eyes something Tiwa had only seen at very specific moments over her life, that serene clarity of someone who found the ground after floating for too long. "That I raised you to do exactly what you did, to question when something makes no sense, to not accept silence as an answer." Her voice thinned but did not break. "And that if I raised someone like that, then nothing of what I went through was wasted." Tiwa embraced her mother, and this time she let the tears come out, without holding back, without restraining them, without the armor she had worn for so many sleepless days. She wept there on the small sofa, with her head on BC's shoulder, while her mother passed her hand through her hair with that old, constant rhythm that had been the same since Tiwa was little. Outside, the night city made its habitual noise, but inside that flat, something had recomposed itself, not the way it was before, because before was no longer possible, but in a new way, a way that had been built on truth, on the courage of a daughter who did not accept silence as an answer, and on two rings that waited decades to finally be in the same room again. And there was still one last piece. Dele Alao had confessed in words, but a confession, without consequence, is just a venting of feelings. And Tiwa had not forgotten that. The letter arrived weeks after the reunion. It was not expected. It had not been requested. It arrived in a simple envelope, without a printed return address, just a name written by hand on the back, in that penmanship of someone who had learned to write in an era when that was still taught with care. Dele Alao. Tiwa stood still in the corridor of the building, holding the envelope for a time before going up. It weighed little in her hand, but she had learned in recent weeks that the heaviest things rarely warn you by their size. She took it to her mother. BC read it alone in the wicker chair on the balcony, while Tiwa waited in the kitchen, pretending to tidy what was already tidy. When her mother called, the letter was folded back on her knee, and her eyes were dry. But there was in them that specific depth of someone who had just processed something that cost them. "He asks for forgiveness," BC said. "Just that?" "No." Her mother looked at the letter, then at her daughter. "He says that when our father died years ago, he found among his belongings a second letter, one that my father had written to Jeed's father, asking them to keep their son away from our family, saying that no Aleo was worthy of a daughter of his." Tiwa remained motionless. "My father," BC said, in that voice that only comes out when someone speaks of someone they loved and who is no longer there. In his own way, he also tried to protect me in the wrong way, but he tried. The silence that descended was different from all the previous ones. It was not the silence of a kept secret, nor of damned pain. It was the silence of when history finally shows all its layers, and we realize that there is rarely a single villain. There are people with different fears making wrong decisions at the same time, in opposite directions. And in the middle of all this are those who love and do not understand why the world insists on complicating what is simple. Dele says he never knew about this letter from my father until he found it, BC continued. That when he found it, he understood he had been a piece of something larger, that the father had used them both. She folded the letter with care. "I don't know if that changes what he did, but it changes the size of what I understand." "Does it change for you?" Tiwa asked. BC thought for an honest moment. "It changes the anger," she said. "It doesn't erase it, but it changes it." Jide learned of the letter's content the same day. Tiwa called him as she went down the stairs, because she had learned that this man processed difficult things better when he had time to assimilate them before having to react in front of someone. She told him everything, the apology, the letter from Tiwa's grandfather, the layers no one had seen. On the other end of the line, a long silence. "So, my father didn't act alone," Jide said finally. "No one acts alone," Tiwa replied. "That is the most complicated part to understand." Another silence. "How is she?" he asked, and Tiwa already knew that when he asked like that, without saying her name, it was because the name carried too much weight to fit at the beginning of the sentence. "The new tests have arrived," she said. "The doctor wants to talk to us next week together, if possible. I will be there." It was not an elaborate promise. It was the simple statement, the kind that needs no reinforcement, because the person speaking has already decided before opening their mouth. "Jide," Tiwa said before hanging up. "Yes? What are you going to do regarding Dele?" A pause that lasted the exact time of a decision being made. "I already called him," Jide replied. "The morning after you told me about the office. It was not an easy conversation, but it was necessary." He took a deep breath. "He is my brother. What he did cannot be undone. But what happens from now on, each of us decides." Tiwa did not answer immediately. "Do you agree?" he asked. "I think," she said with the honesty of someone still building that answer within herself, "that forgiveness is not erasing. It is deciding that the weight of the past is not going to rule the weight of the future." "Exactly that," Jide said. The medical appointment took place on a morning of clear skies. The office of BC's doctor was in the Evercare clinic, a simple room with 2 pictures on the walls and a window looking out at a tree that had grown crooked and remained that way, beautiful in its own way. The doctor was a man of slow speech who had accompanied BC for years and had learned in that time that she preferred the direct truth to disguised kindness. They sat the 3 of them together, BC in the center, Tiwa on one side, Jide on the other, as if the geometry of that moment had been planned by something other than any of them. The doctor explained the new treatment that had arrived, tested in larger centers, with results that were not a guarantee, but were a real possibility. A possibility that depended on resources that BC, until weeks ago, would have had no way of gathering in the necessary time. When he finished, he looked at the 3 and said, with that objectivity of a doctor who does not adorn, because adornment does not cure. "With the treatment, we have concrete reasons to believe in a significant stabilization. Without it, the advance would be inevitable and faster." BC nodded with the calm of someone who had already made peace with the idea that the body has limits, but that she had not reached the limit yet, and while she hadn't, she existed. "So let's do the treatment," she said, like someone deciding the lunch menu, with the same naturalness with which she had always faced the problems she could not avoid, looking straight ahead, without drama, with her feet on the ground. On leaving the clinic, the sun hit the pavement with that generous morning force that does not know the day will harden. The 3 walked together in silence for a few steps, and there was in that silence something Tiwa tried to find words to name and couldn't. It was wholeness, the rare and fragile feeling that the pieces are provisionally where they should be. Jide opened the car for BC. She entered slowly, her movements more careful now, her body asking for consideration she did not always give it. Before getting in, she stopped. She placed her hand over Jide's hand, which was holding the door. She said nothing. He covered her hand with his other, the amber stone ring on one side, the amber stone ring on the other, the 2 rings in the same space after decades on separate hands. Tiwa saw that from the sidewalk and had to look at the crooked tree from the clinic window not to fall apart, right there on the sidewalk. Days later, on an ordinary afternoon that had not promised to be special, Tiwa arrived home and found her mother and Jide in the kitchen. BC was teaching him the recipe for puff puff. Jide was standing beside the stove, with a concentrated expression of a man who spent decades making large-scale decisions and who was now having genuine difficulty understanding the difference between a level spoon and a heaping spoon. "Level," BC repeated patiently, with that tone that mixed instruction and good humor. "Level means it cannot overflow." "I know what level is," he said with a dignity the situation did not justify. "Then, why did you put twice as much?" Tiwa stood at the entrance of the kitchen watching the scene. There was something in it that did not fit into any words she knew. It was not the scene she had imagined in her days of research and meetings and office confessions. It was not cinematic or elaborate. It was a small kitchen with an old stove and 2 human beings discussing the quantity of flour in a recipe for puff puff. It was real, and the real, Tiwa discovered, is always more beautiful than what we imagine, because what we imagine is perfect, and what is perfect does not breathe. That breathed. She entered the kitchen, took a spoon, and said with the naturalness of someone who belonged in that place because she had always belonged, "Can I help?" BC and Jide looked at her at the same time, and both smiled. Semanas después, when the puff puff had already been made and eaten and repeated, when the treatment had begun and the first results were cautiously encouraging, when Jide had begun to appear with a regularity that the small kitchen had learned to receive, Tiwa was back at the Orchid Terrace. Table 12, aligned glasses, crystal chandeliers pouring golden light. On a random night, as ordinary as the one that had changed everything, she cleared the glasses with her usual posture, straight spine, silent steps, a presence that serves without imposing. When Mr. Colavole appeared beside her with that look of someone who knows more than he asks, "You are different," the old maitre d' said in a low voice. "I am," she replied without stopping her movement. "Lighter," he said simply, like someone who laid down something heavy. Tiwa paused for a second, looked at the entire dining room, the tables, the candles, the faces of people who had their own stories she would never know, and thought involuntarily that that table 12 had been the place where a phrase came out before being swallowed, where a ring was seen by eyes that shouldn't have known it, where everything had begun to move after decades of standing still. I laid it down, she confirmed, returning to her work. That night, before going to sleep, Tiwa opened the drawer in her own room. She didn't have a box of credentials like her mother. She had few keepsakes. A childhood photo, an old note from BC, the simple card Jide had given her in that charmless corridor of potted plants. She placed the card with the other keepsakes, closed the drawer, and then lay thinking in the dark of her room about what her mother had said on the sofa after the reunion, that if she had raised someone capable of questioning the silence, then nothing of what she had gone through was wasted. Tiwa understood now what that truly meant. It was not consolation. It was not the beautiful sentence we say to turn pain into meaning. It was the precise observation of a woman who had looked back, summed what she lost with what she built, and arrived at a sum that was not zero, but positive. Because pain that shapes is not lost pain, silence that teaches to question is not useless silence, and a daughter raised alone in a third-floor flat without an elevator, who one day served water in a restaurant of crystal chandeliers, and did not swallow a question that needed to be asked, that daughter was living proof that certain stories do not end where we think they end. They wait with the patience of a ring that stays on a finger for entire decades, crossing everything, guarding what cannot be kept in words. They wait for the right moment, and when that moment arrives, on a random night, at a random table, in a phrase spoken without thinking, everything that was still moves at once, and nothing, absolutely nothing, goes back to being as it was before.